Good morning. I have a 7-part series here on my thoughts of the upcoming Saturn-Neptune conjunction and some related topics. Most of these videos aren't too long. Hopefully the longest will be about 30 minutes, and this first one may be the longest. So let's get started. I'll see if I can share my screen here. This will take just a minute as I have to get rid of some panels so that I can see what I'm doing. So bear with me just a little bit longer. Okay, and we're ready. This first one is the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. I'll just cover some general stuff about it. And these are my thoughts for the Mundane Astrology Special Interest Group, Part 1. And I'm Christopher Benton. All right, and looking at past Saturn-Neptune conjunctions, I've categorized things in the following way: dissolving, breaking down. Number 2, new visions, protests, building up. Number 3, oppression, censorship, boundaries. Number 4, descensions and ascensions. By this, I mean people who die or go out of power, and people who rise up and go into power. If we go back to dissolving, breaking down, this is what happens when Neptune gets the upper hand. And during times of Saturn-Neptune conjunctions, often old ideologies go away and new visions or ideologies come to take their place. And those new visions could be either good visions or bad visions. So that leads us into new visions, protests, and building up. During this process, sometimes Saturn gets the upper hand. Saturn doesn't necessarily want its structure to be broken down, and this can lead to oppression, censorship, and the establishment of new boundaries. So let's take a look at some things that have happened in the past. When it comes to dissolving and breaking down, well, in 2025, and certainly in America, Trump and Doge have been working to break down government structures. Trump has broken down global trade through tariffs. He's begun mass deportations. He's disrespected many, if not most, of America's allies. And at times he has stymied growth in the economy and the stock market through his policies, particularly tariffs. This next one I have here is interesting: airplane malfunctions. Right from the very beginning of 2025, there have been crashes, equipment malfunctions, equipment breaking down for both airplanes and helicopters. How does this relate to the Saturn-Neptune conjunction? Well, we usually think of Neptune as ruling things without boundaries, such as liquids, the ocean, the seas. But the atmosphere is also without boundaries. Air doesn't take on a boundary necessarily. And the atmosphere is another kind of ocean. And just as boats or ships sail the seas, airplanes are airships that sail this atmospheric ocean. They are the structure that rides upon that unstructured entity, so to speak. So the structure of these airships has been breaking down all year long, particularly in America. And I relate that too to the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. In 2025, we have had a measles outbreak in America. And one thing I've noticed is that we usually get some sort of viral outbreak during a Saturn-Neptune conjunction. Let's see, we had a roof collapse at a concert in Santo Domingo that killed hundreds. We had large power outages in Spain and Portugal, again, structures breaking down. Fires in Los Angeles, major wildfires in Canada, major earthquakes, 6.0 or larger in China, Taiwan, Cayman Islands, Ethiopia, Solomon Islands, Myanmar, Tonga, Istanbul, and Chile, and volcanic eruptions in Hawaii, Philippines, Indonesia, Colombia, Alaska, offshore Oregon. It hasn't happened yet. It's considered imminent. And also volcanic eruptions in Iceland and Italy. In nature, we see structures breaking down quite a bit, it seems, during Saturn-Neptune conjunctions, and a lot of environmental disasters or events occurring. Let's see, we also had Israel and the US bombing Iran in 2025. Okay, now going back to the Saturn-Neptune conjunction of 1989, we saw the fall of the Berlin Wall. That was literally a structure that dissolved before our very eyes. We saw the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, and US invaded Panama. And that's interesting because Trump has been threatening to invade Panama. Not recently, but when he first began his second term, that was high on his list, along with some other things, like taking over Greenland and making Canada a part of the United States. Okay, some other things that happened in '89. We had the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, overthrow of communist dictatorship in Romania. Communism fell in Poland and Eastern Europe. There was a Paraguayan coup d'etat. There was another measles outbreak in America in 1989. Going back to 1953, we had two uprisings in the Soviet Union. An Iranian coup d'etat overthrew the democratically elected prime minister with the help of the CIA. And of course, we installed the Shah of Iran. There was the North Sea flood of 1953 that killed over 2,000 people in the Netherlands and the United Kingdom and several hundred at sea, another environmental disaster. An earthquake in Turkey that caused over 1,000 deaths. The Ionian earthquake of magnitude 7.2 in Greece. An F5 tornado hit the downtown section of Waco, Texas. Another tornado outbreak sequence killed 116 people in Flint, Michigan. And polio cases peaked in the US, another viral outbreak. And there were riots in Cairo. Also, Bolivian Revolution in 1952, 7.5 earthquake in Tibet, San Juan earthquake in Argentina, Kern County earthquake in California, an earthquake that hit the Soviet Union. I think we had another big earthquake in the same region this year. If we go back to 1918, that was the year of the Spanish flu, another viral outbreak. We had the Bolshevik Revolution and the beginning of communism in 1917. America entered World War I. And we had the Battle of Jerusalem that was between the British and the Ottoman Empire. And there was a tornado that devastated Mattoon, Illinois. So a lot of similar kinds of events taking place during Saturn-Neptune conjunctions, all kinds of boundaries breaking down and dissolving. Now let's look at New Vision's protests and building up. Trump's vision at the beginning of this year was a desire to take over Canada, Greenland, the Panama Canal, and Gaza, and he proposed removing all Palestinians from Gaza. He also renamed the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. And there have been a lot of mass protests. There have been big protests against Trump's policies in America. Mass protests in Indonesia, Turkey, Mali. White South Africans protested in Peoria. Just yesterday, there was a big protest in Mexico City against the decades of corruption. and crime. And many of the protests around the world are apparently being led by the young people that are known as Gen Z. Those are the young adults today, and they are the ones participating in a lot of these protests, but they're also getting support from older people too in some places. We've also had several U.S. courts push back against Trump policies, and now going back to 1990 and 1989. In 1990, there was the unification of Yemen, the end of apartheid, the end of the Cold War. Perestroika continues, and it's very interesting that the Russian word perestroika, if I'm correct, it literally means restructuring. And that is what happens during Saturn-Neptune conjunctions. There were also famous protests in Tiananmen Square, and then democratic reforms under Deng Xiaoping. There was the first presidential election in Brazil after the end of military rule. The first internet service providers appeared. CNN 24-hour news also became very popular. It began several years earlier, but its coverage of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the unfolding saga during the protests in Tiananmen Square, that really made a lot of people begin to tune in to CNN and adopt this fascination for 24-hour news coverage. One of the things I've noticed is that there are usually some new things that come along in media during Saturn-Neptune conjunctions. Whatever is new this time has probably already appeared, and I am probably just not that aware of it because I'm old and it's hard to keep up with the latest technology. Okay, going back to the early 50s, Christine Jorgensen had the first successful sex reassignment surgery in Denmark. Television became popular. So that was the media form or format that became widespread as a result of the Saturn-Neptune conjunction in 1952-53. And there are a couple of reasons why television became so popular. In America, 68% of all television sets tuned into I Love Lucy to watch Lucille Ball give birth to little Ricky. And in the United Kingdom, people bought TVs to watch the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. Let's see, also in 1953, Hugh Hefner published the first issue of Playboy magazine that was breaking down certain boundaries. Aldous Huxley tried psychedelic hallucinogen mescaline, which inspired his book, The Doors of Perception. Jonas Salk announced his polio vaccine. Egypt declared itself a republic, new boundaries. There were protests in Afghanistan, UFOs flying over Washington, D.C. In 1952, they were actually buzzing the White House. The first open heart surgery was performed. And now going back to the Saturn-Neptune conjunction of 1917, radio became very popular. In part, this was so that people could receive news about World War I. But here is another media format that gained popularity during the time of the Saturn-Neptune conjunction. Also, women won the right to vote in New York. The Balfour Declaration was made by Britain, expressing the sentiment that a homeland for the Jews ought to be established in the territory of Palestine. And then there was the miracle of the sun at Fatima in Portugal in 1917. If we look at oppression, censorship, and boundaries during Saturn-Neptune conjunctions, well, Trump has certainly done a lot. He has been deporting people without due process, invoking the Alien Enemies Act. He's engaged in censorship of words and policies he doesn't like. He's engaged in political retribution. He sent Marines, National Guard, Border Patrol, and these masked ICE agents into Los Angeles, and he sent them into several other cities too, sweeping up a lot of American citizens along with illegal aliens. Elsewhere, there's been a violent crackdown by the Syrian transitional government this year, going back to the conjunctions of 1989. There's something called the Satanic Panic that I missed entirely back when it happened, but apparently at that time in America and elsewhere, there were a lot of people who believed that these satanic cults were going to take over the world, and they were very fearful of that, and panic ensued. There was a political oppression following Tiananmen Square protests, the fatwa issued against author Salman Rushdie, and going back to 53, early 50s, Georgia approved the first literature censorship board in the United States. The Korean War ended with a divided Korea, so that's new boundaries coming into being. The CIA began the MK Ultra program and approved the study of the use of LSD in interrogations. They wanted to see if it could be used as a truth serum. And they studied that by just giving people LSD without their knowledge. Also, in the early 50s, we had this period that we call McCarthyism in America. The Senate committee headed by Senator Joseph McCarthy was making lots of people appear before them to testify about communist activities, and often they were told they had to name names. If they didn't name names, they would be blacklisted and unable to get a job. Going back to 1917, the Espionage Act was passed in America, followed by the Sedition Act in 1918. Also, the Prohibition Amendment passed by Congress in 1917. And then there was this event known as the Night of Terror. This was a night when several women were protesting out in front of the White House for the right to vote, and they were attacked and severely beaten and brutalized by men. And now we come to some dissensions and ascensions. So let's see, this year Pope Francis died, and Robert Prevost became Pope Leo XIV. Justin Trudeau resigned. Going back to 1990, 1989, Nelson Mandela was released from prison. Emperor Hirohito died. The Ayatollah Khomeini died. Going back further to the conjunction in the early 50s, Stalin died. Nikita Khrushchev rose to power. There's the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. David Ben-Gurion resigned as Prime Minister of Israel. King Hussein was crowned King of Jordan. Prior to that, his father, King Talal, had abdicated. King George VI of Britain died. King Farouk of Egypt abdicated. And in America, a Republican, Dwight Eisenhower, became the USA president. And this is momentous because the Democrats had big control of the White House for several years. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president, I believe, 3 times. We now have an amendment saying that a person can be president only for 2 terms, but he was a Democrat, and when he died in office, he was succeeded by Harry Truman. who finished out his term and then had a term of his own. Also in 1952, during the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, Vladimir Putin was born. And he's certainly causing a lot of trouble in the world today. And going back to 1917, we had Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, and he and his family were executed the following year. Okay, now, let me just say one more word about this list I've gone through. This is some historical research, but it's not as scientific as I would like if I were writing this up for a definitive study. The thing I don't like about it from a scientific point of view is I am certainly picking out of history events that seem to coincide with the nature of a Saturn-Neptune conjunction. If I wanted to make this more rigorous, I would need to look at periods where there wasn't a Saturn-Neptune conjunction and see how many events like this occurred during those periods and try and determine statistically if events of this nature are more likely to occur during Saturn-Neptune conjunctions rather than other times. So I'm not being 100% scientific here, but nonetheless, these are events of the sort that we tend to expect these days during Saturn-Neptune conjunction. So they do bolster our confidence a bit, but the next step would be to do a more rigorous study and to try and verify that these sorts of events that I've been describing really do occur more often during Saturn-Neptune conjunctions than at other times. But continuing on, let's see, we had Neptune enter Aries right at the end of March this year on March 30th. And I've written here, when Neptune leaves Pisces for Aries, people want to turn visions into realities. The impetus is now to take action based upon beliefs and worldviews. Also, wars and aggression are based on belief systems are more likely. And going back to 1861, these are some of the conflicts that occurred around the world. The last time that Neptune went into Aries, we had the American Civil War. Serfdom was abolished in Russia. Benito Juarez captured Mexico City. The Bamana Empire of Mali fell. The Taranaki War ended in New Zealand. There's a peasant uprising in part of Russia. The Taiping Rebellion in China. The Argentine Civil War, which has been ongoing, was going fairly strongly, I believe, in 1861. There were also Australian frontier wars and War of Resistance in French Indochina. Okay, and this doesn't have to do with war or aggression, but I thought this was very interesting. In 1861, the whale oil industry came to an end and the petroleum oil industry began. And oil, being a liquid, is usually considered as being ruled by Neptune. On May 24th of 2025, Saturn entered Aries. And I've written here, when Saturn leaves Pisces for Aries, people want to build the structures they've been dreaming about. And as Saturn and Neptune become conjunct, old structures will dissolve as new social movements emerge. Okay, now these bar graphs show you the periods for the current Saturn-Neptune conjunction. And this summer, we effectively had Saturn and Neptune conjunct all summer long for the most part, within a 1-degree orb. This conjunction never became exact, but this summer we got a taste of what it would mean to have Saturn and Neptune conjunct in Aries. And then in 2026, we get the exact conjunction on February 20th. And with a 1-degree orb, this conjunction will be in effect. It will be strong for about a month, from about the beginning of the second week of February through the middle of the first week of March. And for those who are interested, here is a table of stations and ingresses for Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune in 2025 and 2026. And it's interesting to me that Neptune went retrograde in Aries on July 4th, and Saturn went retrograde in Aries on July 12th. So basically, in the summer of 2025, this year, Saturn and Neptune dipped their toes into the water, or as I would say, they dipped their toes. They took their toes out of the water, out of Pisces, and dipped them into the hot, arid desert of Aries. But before long, they both turned retrograde. It's like they said, okay, we need to think about this a bit. So they just had a little experience of what it meant to be conjunct in Aries before turning retrograde. On September 5th, Uranus turned retrograde. It had entered Gemini on July 7th, but it also was just getting a taste of things before it decided to go retrograde, and it went back into Taurus on November 7th. Right now, both Saturn and Neptune are back in Pisces. But by the end of November and by December 10th, both Saturn and Neptune will have turned direct. They will have made up their mind that they're going to proceed into the future. And Neptune will go back into Aries on January 26th. Saturn will go back into Aries on February 13th. We have the Saturn-Neptune conjunction a week later. And on April 25th, 2026, Uranus will go back into Gemini, and then everything is going to be set. We'll have Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto in either Gemini or Aries. That's going to be air and fire signs. So everything will have shifted from this earth and water emphasis into air and fire. Now, I often say this is not your parents' Saturn-Neptune conjunction coming up. This is not even your grandparents' Saturn-Neptune conjunction. There are several reasons why I believe this Saturn-Neptune conjunction is going to be extremely powerful, one for the ages, and that it will signal a huge turning point for humankind. For one thing, this Saturn-Neptune conjunction is occurring in the first degree of Aries. And anything that happens on the first degree of a cardinal sign is said to be on the world axis. The first degree of any cardinal sign is a point of increased intensity and strength. So simply because Saturn and Neptune are happening within the first degree of Aries, this should be a very, very powerful Saturn, Neptune, or a very powerful conjunction of these two planets. But when is the last time that Saturn and Neptune were conjunct in the first degree of Aries? Well, using first artificial intelligence and then the electional chart finder on Solar Fire, it looks like the last time that this happened in Aries, I kept pointing to this one for 2025, but this is going to be 2026. This will be the 2026 conjunction over here. And it appears that the last time we had these two planets conjunct in the first degree of Aries was in the year 4361 BCE, before the Common Era. And this happened not long before the invention of writing and the development of calendar systems. And historians designate approximately 4000 BCE as the dawn of civilization. So we can think of this conjunction approximately 6,000 years ago as a huge turning point for humanity, the dawn of civilization, the development of writing and calendar systems. Similarly, this Saturn-Neptune conjunction, it could go either two ways, I think. If this one represents the beginning of humanity in some respects, the one in 2026 could represent the end of humanity or the end of humanity's dominance of the planet. Or, just as this one represented a huge evolutionary leap forward for humanity, so the one on February 20th of 2026 could represent another forward leap for humanity. I suspect that humanity is going to continue and that we are going to leap forward, but it will probably be a rough and rocky road at first, and it may be a few hundred years before we can realize in retrospect that this was the turning point. Okay, well, this is one huge reason why I think this is going to be a very momentous conjunction that takes place in 2026. It happens on the world axis, and it's a conjunction that hasn't happened in this first degree of Aries for over 6,000 years. So it's like the end and beginning of perhaps another 6,000 year cycle. Now, it's also going to be more powerful than normal simply because 3 days prior to the exact conjunction, there is a solar eclipse. And in the solar eclipse, we already have Saturn and Neptune pretty tightly conjunct. And we also have Uranus making a strong square to Sun and Neptune. That suggests a lot of things are going to break up. A lot of chaos and erraticness in the world following this particular square. However, the fact that Sun and Moon are in Aquarius and Uranus is the ruler of Aquarius or co-ruler of Aquarius, that might ameliorate the negative impacts of this square. Let's hope so. It might just be a sudden surge in technology and technological developments. Still, I'm expecting a certain amount of chaos along with the conjunction of Saturn and Neptune. If we look at midpoints, that'll be very close in terms of activation. On February 20th, 2026, we have the moon at the midpoint, almost exactly at the midpoint of Saturn in Chiron and Neptune in Chiron, just 1 minute of arc away from exact. We'll also have Chiron here at the midpoint of Mercury and Uranus. And Saturn and Neptune are going to be at the midpoint of Uranus and Pluto. Now we could organize things this way. We have Saturn, Neptune at the midpoint of Uranus and Pluto, Chiron at the midpoint of Uranus and Mercury, and the moon at the midpoint of Saturn, Neptune, and Chiron. So a lot of these higher transcendent energies are all getting funneled through the moon, which means that we are all going to be impacted, but personally and emotionally. Okay, there's another thing which is going to make this Saturn-Neptune conjunction more powerful or more momentous than usual. And I was first tipped off to this by a video put out by the World Astrology Report, a video they had on YouTube. And this has to do with declination. And before I show you what's going to happen with Saturn and Neptune right after their conjunction, let me use the sun's annual declination cycle to explain why equinoxes and solstices are literally turning points. We have a graph here which looks like a typical sine curve, and this represents the motion of the sun each year, where we start at the spring equinox, where the sun is at 0 degrees declination. As we move toward the summer solstice, the sun will move further north in declination, and it reaches a peak at the summer solstice. And then it starts moving back towards 0 degrees declination. So this is literally a turning point at the summer solstice. Things are changing from increasing to decreasing on this graph. Okay, now at this point here, we're back at 0 degrees declination, and it's the fall equinox. And after that, the sun moves into the southern declinations. And this is also a turning point, not only because the sun is moving from northern declinations to southern declinations, but also because visually you can see this graph is changing from concave down. Concave down looks like a cup turned over so that spills water. So we switch from that to this portion of the graph, which is concave up. It looks like a cup which would hold water. So the fall equinox is another turning point. The sun moves further south in declination until we get to the winter solstice. And then the declination starts increasing again. So this is another turning point because the motion of the sun's declination is switching from decreasing to increasing again. And then at this point, we get back to the spring equinox. Now, the same sort of sine curve and the turning points I've marked off on it. These points actually apply to any cycle. And for any 360-degree cycle, we have turning points at 0 degrees, 9 degrees, 180 degrees, 270 degrees, and then 360 degrees, which is equivalent to 0 degrees again. But here you can see visually, very geometrically, why we always have a turning point at every 90 degrees or every quarter of a cycle. All right. So what is happening around the time of the February 20th, 2026 Saturn-Neptune conjunction? Well, in March and April, both Saturn and Neptune will cross this line for 0 degrees declination, going from southern declination into northern declination. And when Neptune crosses over 0 declination, it denotes a change in the social myth. When both Saturn and Neptune, with both Saturn and Neptune crossing together, we expect restructuring of myths. And here is a magnification of the event. We first have Saturn crossing 0 degrees declination, going from southern declination to northern declination. Neptune is going to soon follow, but it's going to go back and forth a couple of more times. It gets very close to 0 degrees declination here in 2028, and then it continues on upward into northern declination. Okay, so the points in time where Saturn and Neptune cross 0 degrees declination, those can be turning points. And we have two occurring this year in March and April. And we have one, it looks like, in later in 2026, maybe around October. And then in 2027, around March. And then we get close to it. It looks like right at the end of 2027. Now, to give you some history of what has happened in the past, in the 20th century, Neptune and Chiron crossed the zero declination point together at the end of World War II, and the result was a new worldview coupled with healing. We began a new world order at the end of World War II, with America emerging as perhaps the first superpower. And following the American Civil War, we had, let's see, Pluto, Neptune, and Saturn all crossing 0 degrees declination at about the same time. Looks like Pluto and Neptune going north, Saturn going south. This resulted in changing social beliefs. Neptune, America transformed Pluto, and Reconstruction, Saturn. Okay, just about at the end of this first part. If you want more information on the history of Saturn-Neptune conjunctions, you might already be aware of this, but Chris Brennan and Nick Dagan-Best have done about a 9-hour video on the Saturn-Neptune conjunctions in history that you can find at the Astrology Podcast. It looks over here like Nick Dagan-Best has this really weird spiky hair. That is actually just a painting behind him. So this is his real hair right here. Also, for more information, it's worth reading the book Planetary Cycles by the late great mundane astrologer Andre Barbeau. This has been translated into English, and it gives good information on the Saturn-Neptune synodic cycle as well as other outer planet synodic cycles. And not on the Saturn-Neptune conjunction specifically, but still very interesting with regard to synodic cycles. There is a movie you can rent or buy at Amazon Prime about the work of Andre Barbeau in mundane astrology, and it's called The Astrology of Pandemics. And this is a very fascinating account. So I really recommend both this book and this video. All right. So this has just been some food for thought on the upcoming exact conjunction of Saturn and Neptune. However, there are several other important related topics that need to be discussed in conjunction, no pun intended, with this, and which I'll address in some other short videos. And among these topics are Trump's birth chart and the inauguration chart for Trump's second term, and the impact of the Saturn-Neptune conjunction on Trump. I think the conjunction is going to give Trump only a glancing blow, but nonetheless, because of his current position and power in the world, everything going on has to also be considered with respect to Donald Trump, and that's why I want to briefly go over his birth chart and the inauguration chart for his second term, because that sets the backdrop for other events that will happen that are more directly related to Saturn-Neptune. And then I'll do a video talking more specifically about the impact of the Saturn-Neptune conjunction on America, another one regarding the impact of this conjunction on Russia. Russia has a very long history of being impacted by Saturn-Neptune conjunctions. And then there's another important astrological event going on, which will influence things. And I don't think we can talk about Saturn Neptune without also talking about the Uranus Neptune Pluto minor grand trine that is going to endure through 2028, I believe. And along with that, I'll have a separate video on the Uranus-Pluto synodic cycle, which began in the latter half of the 1960s, created all the social upheaval of that decade, and the upcoming 5 exact Uranus-Pluto trines we're going to have. And then I'll end with a very quick video, really just 2 slides. There'll be a quick note on the impact of Pluto out of bounds and where we currently are in the Barbeau Planetary Cycle Index and what that Planetary Cycle Index is. Okay, so that's going to be it for this video. Let me stop sharing. And I'm back. I'm sitting here in the TARDIS. That stands for Time and Relative Dimensions in Space. Many of you will recognize this as Doctor Who's phone booth that he travels throughout space and time in. This is a 1960s, 1970s version of the TARDIS. So, since we are traveling through time and space in mundane astrology, this seems appropriate. Okay, well, I hope this video has been informative to you. Some of you probably already know everything I've talked about. And for others, this may be new information, but I think it's pretty good information, and it's a good starting point for things. And I hope you tune in to the other short videos I'm going to make. So for now, I'll just say so long and be well.